right. Hi, everyone. Um, my name is Shannon Bower. And honestly, when it comes to talking about transdisciplinary work, I am no longer certain how to introduce myself. I think this is a side effect of this kind of work. So I am a freshwater fisheries researcher. I am a conservation scientist. I am sometimes a geographer and social scientist. And at other times, I am support staff. I am whatever I need to be to get the job done. I am also the co-founder and director of fisheries research for a new not-for-profit organization called Infinity. And this organization uses transdisciplinary approaches to try and bridge the gap between research outcomes and their translation into action. So today I'm going to be talking about how I use transdisciplinary approaches in my work, though I do usually refer to this as co-creation, which is a lot easier to say. And I'm hoping that those of you who are already trying to do this sort of work might get something out of it, even if it's just a sense of commiseration. And I hope that those of you who are looking to include some elements of transdisciplinarity into your work might find some of my experiences helpful. But of course, before we get to the juicy bits, we have to start at the beginning, more or less. So a few years ago, a colleague and a friend and I were chatting, and he asked if I had ever heard of the paper that I've shown here on the screen, Counting the Books While the Library Burns. And my friend was feeling so frustrated in that moment and felt that that's what we're doing. That's what we've been doing. We're spending so much of our time and our money monitoring and documenting declines, but we're not taking enough action to actually stop any of the declines. And I remember this moment really clearly, not just because I was struck pretty hard by what I felt was the truth of what he was saying, but specifically because of my own journey and experiences in moving through conservation into research, into transdisciplinarity. And I'd worked so hard to get to that exact moment in time, but I was suddenly recognizing that need to alter course again. And so for context, I started my work in the field of conservation in 2002, working for grassroots NGOs specializing in wildlife trauma care across North America. And so like many of you, I worked incredibly long hours, toiling away for years because I felt I had found my mission. I had found my joy and the work I was meant to do. Now I've been kind to you here, and I have shown you some of the cuter images, but much of this work involved being really up close and personal with the pain and suffering that humans can cause wild animals, but also the damage we cause to wild places and wild spaces. And so after working so hard alongside so many other incredible people, and after witnessing so much, I had come to feel as though we were all just working to hold back this water gushing from a crumbling dam with literally no tools but our bare hands. And I felt that that wall was crumbling. And I decided that the work might be better served if I could try and get ahead of it, if I could make my way into research and policy so that maybe I could help keep that dam from crumbling in the first place. And so it was at this time that I made the choice to focus my efforts on freshwater conservation, particularly in the fisheries realm. And I felt that freshwater ecosystems were underrepresented and that fisheries were far more crucial to human lives and livelihood than they were given credit for. And so in the intervening years since I started this journey, I had become aware of the many positive changes in the world of conservation. Georgina Mace wrote a paper describing the really welcome transition in conservation-oriented work from people versus nature to people and nature. And at the same time, we were seeing increasing calls from researchers and practitioners everywhere to move beyond single and multidisciplinary work and to create something more together, something entirely new. And that was the way I first heard of transdisciplinary research described. And I thought, again, this is it, I found it. And I'm really grateful to both TBTI and to Rachana in particular for introducing me to this concept and for believing in it so strongly. It's absolutely a vision that I share. And so all in all, it took almost 15 years to re-educate myself, obtain my PhD, and create a strong network of wonderful and driven and talented people to get to where I felt I needed to be. And so I made it to the brass ring of academia, a secure tenure track position as an assistant professor at a university in Sweden. And I was finally in the position to do all the work I'd wanted to do all those years ago. Only I couldn't get the phrase out of my head. We're counting the books while the library burns. So don't get me wrong. I strongly believe research and monitoring are important, crucially, vitally important. We need to know how these systems work, what communities and fishers and fish need to survive and thrive. And all of that work helps us make better decisions, but it's not enough. So we need to do the work that we're recommending. We need to help bring research and management and policy and tradition and culture and sustainability and communities all together to come together to guide us into how to do this work. So essentially, we need more than transdisciplinary research. We need transdisciplinary action too. And so, of course, the situation continues. This recent paper, incidentally written by a student of the friend and colleague with whom I had that first fateful conversation, found that more than 50% of conservation funding is still going to research and monitoring efforts. And again, these are definitely important. But with so many fish species and fishing communities around the world so vulnerable to so many impacts and processes, research and monitoring aren't enough. We need to get our boots on the ground too. And in doing so, I am hopeful that we can create a strong connection between research outcomes and practitioners and help turn this vitally important research into meaningful action. And so now it's very important for me to point out at this stage that all of this represents my own perspectives, and I don't want it to come across as though you can't work in academia and take action. I think the group delivering this course is proof of concept that you absolutely can. You can take effective action in whatever sector and in whatever way works for you. But for me, I just couldn't get away from the sense that I had somehow taken just a slightly wrong turn. I couldn't get the need for more action out of my head. So I made the absolutely terrifying decision to leave my shiny, secure position and my wonderful team of coworkers to see if I could try a different approach. So this move has happened just about a year ago, a year and a half, I guess now. And so it's still new and the jury is still out on whether this was the best or worst decision of my life. And I will acknowledge that a global pandemic has not been particularly helpful. But in the intervening time, I have learned a lot about what transdisciplinary action looks like from this boots on the ground point of view. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be discussing some of the things I've learned, mostly from the point of view of mistakes that I've made, because for better or worse, that's how I learn best. So I'll start with pointing out that working in the not-for-profit sector has many similar funding pitfalls to working in academia. So you still need to write grant proposals. You are still going to get more of those turned down than you get accepted. You still need to create teams to get funding. But a big benefit that I've noticed is that you are able to create a much more diverse team across sectors and build a lot more flexibility into your projects. One huge drawback is that you need to keep an eye on funding restrictions, because a lot of funders in these new funding pots that you now have access to as a not-for-profit, a lot of funders are willing to pay for the project, but not for your time. So assuming that you need to pay bills and feed yourself and your family, you need to watch where you apply. But once you have some funding organized, pretty much all action-oriented fisheries work, whether it's conservation-based or conflict-based or otherwise, can definitely be described as a wicked problem. And as you're learning in this course, wicked problems have certain features. So among them, they are inherently difficult to solve in that they are often never actually completed. They involve a lot of complex moving parts, and that action, the sphere that I'm interested in, tends to trigger a lot of feedback reactions. So it's no surprise then that wicked problems tend to require wicked solutions. And this is messy, messy work. So some of the best bits of advice I ever read were in this paper, Fisheries and Coastal Governance is a Wicked Problem, written by some very familiar faces. And this book that, despite its aggressive title, described how to start from the solution. And the underlying idea supported by both sources was that if you can get all parties to agree on the solution, you don't necessarily have to agree on where you're starting from. And it is in fact often easier to work with different perspectives on how to achieve different ideas of how to get there than it is to agree on where you're starting from. Now, I hadn't really explored any of these ideas when I participated in the work shown on this slide, but this was the project I first thought of when the other ideas coalesced. In this project, I naively thought that it would be enough to get as many voices as I could to the table so we could hear from everyone. And we wanted to create a list of priorities for the research and conservation of Moisir, which is a group of highly important species in Southwestern Asia. And in this case, we started by getting people to the table and letting everyone have their say. Bring all the dirty laundry and get it out on the table. But this actually had the unfortunate effect of amplifying united voices and drowning out dissenting voices before we even got started on the work. And so this also meant that as a result, the list we ended up with, while certainly reflective of the majority of priorities from the dominant groups, failed to incorporate all of the perspectives as much as I might have wished. So had I known then what I know now, I would have started from the other end by brainstorming priorities with the broader group, and then worked on connecting research priorities to outcomes. So the second one, also important. It's important to start defining potential solutions and your role early on. And by this, I mean that while you can't be rigid about your role, you shouldn't fail to define it either. So one of the more challenging aspects of transdisciplinary work for me has been in realizing that the nature of my role changes with every project, and that sometimes my scientist hat is a lot less welcome than I would hope. And so when you've trained for years to design and execute and analyze research studies and provide advice, it can be very difficult to realize that not only do you often need to begin your work by advocating for the role of science in a project, but even more importantly, you yourself need to understand that sometimes science is just not the most important tool in the toolbox. Often your role is going to be to use science to support other processes. And it can take time to both accept and to learn how to do this. And so I've learned that while it's okay to have all these different hats, you need to figure out which hat or hats you'll be wearing for any given project. And I've also learned to make sure that these roles get defined as early as I can, not necessarily rigidly, but early. Because I found that if I don't do this, my role in the team tends to become blurred or even feels inconsequential. So for number 3, in this work, I am always aiming for a balance between being adequately prepared and being so prepared that I gain rigidity and lose flexibility. But the truth is you do need a bit of both. So preparation, organization, and a dash of rigidity will help you keep your work focused. It will keep you and your team on timeline and reduce really avoidable snags related to not having what you need when you need it. So you need some rigidity to be able to make room for flexibility, because flexibility is where the magic happens. This is where the ideas percolate and relationships develop. And if you're really lucky, something will show up to show you what you've been missing. So my favorite visual example of this is here on the screen for you. And it took place at a community workshop in Whitehorse, where my colleague and I had presented all of the work that our team had discovered related to salmon culture in a community over the course of a year. And so we'd initially planned this as more of a reporting event where we show you what we've done. But we saw the opportunity to build in some flexibility. So we gave everyone sticky notes and Sharpies and asked them to tell us what was missing and what we got wrong. And you can very clearly see the difference in the image on the left and the one on the right. But by building in some flexibility into not only our workshop, but our own stances on rightness, we were gifted with entire layers of connections and ideas that we were able to bring forward into the next phase of our project. Number 4. So full disclosure, this one is really hard for me. And who doesn't prefer comfort over discomfort? But when you're working as a team with a lot of people with different expertise and different perspectives, you can plan on feeling uncomfortable a lot of the time. So again, a good example of this is my work with First Nations governments in the Yukon Territory. Over the past years, I've spent significant amounts of time supporting First Nations communities in developing community-based salmon management plans that prioritize cultural continuity and cultural connection. And in these circumstances, it's really important to recognize that traditional scientific research has a colonialist perspective that doesn't always lend itself to supporting culturally oriented work. And as an outsider, not only of the nations that I work with, but of the territory itself, I have to earn trust and develop relationships, and there are no shortcuts for this. And so it can be really frustrating to feel like you're bristling with ideas that no one wants to hear, or feel that you somehow haven't earned your place at the table. But all of that is ego stuff that needs to be let go of. Discomfort can also be where you remember to forgive yourself when you make mistakes. Discomfort is where you remember that you aren't familiar with every aspect of community relationships and politics, and that these things matter. And so discomfort, if you allow it to be, tends to be the most fertile soil for generating success. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, this work is messy. The problems are messy, the solutions are messy, and nothing seems to work the way you think it should or in the way you plan for. So for me to do this work in fisheries is to understand and to do your best with the good, the bad, and sometimes the very ugly. So if I were to describe the dream, I would tell you that I start these processes by helping all parties agree on a desirable future state, regardless of starting point. And then our team works to develop a consensus on the best way to get there while dealing with all of the conflict issues that arise throughout. And if I were to describe the reality, I would need to acknowledge that the process has literally never worked as I have just described it. And that's just how it goes. So my mother-in-law is fond of saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And that definitely applies. But the idea that most supports what I'm trying to get across is that of jugaad. So I do a lot of work in India, and that is where I picked up on this marvelous concept. So jugaad is a word in the Hindi language that describes a process of making something functional. So whatever you're making is usually cobbled together, and there may be duct tape or twine involved. But in the end, what you're making does what you need it to do. And I still hope that the dream of seamless transdisciplinary action is possible. But for now, I am content with trying to jugaad my way into success. And what is success? So this brings us to our last point. If wicked problems are never solved, and if wicked solutions are always changeable, and if we need to monitor solutions to ensure that they don't become maladaptive over time, then what is success anyway? And in some cases, we need to see solutions that are able to adapt to changing conditions. In other cases, we need to see solutions that support as many people and or fish species as possible. So the problem as I see it is more with the concept of success, because it often resembles a single point in time far more than the multi-directional complex process that it actually is. So if I were to say anything helpful about success, it would be this. As with your role and your solutions, I recommend trying to define what success means to you and to your group and to your work as early and as flexibly as possible. And I say flexibly because you are not likely to end a project with the same definition of success that you started out with. But if you follow some of these hints, trust yourself, and if you're really lucky, you just may end up with something wonderful that you never saw coming. And so with that, I hope there was something in this talk of value to you. Thank you for listening and for being here online. And I wish you all the best of luck in your course and all of the success that you could want in your future transdisciplinary work. So thank you.